Hello, class. Welcome back. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, whatever time you're watching this. So we're getting close to the end of this semester. Got three more chapters to go. So today we're going to be going over chapter 13, Aging and the Elderly. And this will wrap up Unit 3 for us. So that means we've got the Unit 3 written assignment and the Unit 3 exam around the corner, as well as the Chapter 13 quiz. So make sure you log in the Blackboard, check your course schedule, see when all that's going to be due coming up here for you. Alrighty, so let's get started with Chapter 13, Aging and the Elderly. So like the concepts we've been talking about the past few weeks, gender, sexuality, race and ethnicity, this concept of old, right, quote unquote old, is very socially defined. It depends, how we define old depends on what society we are in, right? What time period we're in. And every culture has different kind of expectations and assumptions about, what aging means, and kind of our beliefs about, what old people can or cannot do. And a lot of that is a product of our socialization. So that's kind of what we'll be focusing on this week. And, unlike, we can all look back at our childhoods and think about that stage of life because we've all been through it. Or maybe we have kids and we're watching them go through it. But, being elderly and reflecting on old age is a little bit different. It's something that even I will learn soon enough here. But it's something that, you only really experience, what it means to be quote unquote old or elderly when you're going through it. Now, if we think about kind of our media, sure, there's some exceptions, right? But by and large, a lot of our media portrayals are pretty negative when it comes to how we depict the elderly in our society. Usually, they tend to be, kind of sleepy or grumpy or rude, or kind of, irrational, right? And our society, staying on media, we tend to glorify the youth of our society. And, to be youthful equates with beauty and ambition and, being athletic and sexual. And, if you're elderly, all of those different attributes or characteristics just can't apply to you. And this, kind of bears its fruit in the fact that, we have a multi-billion-dollar market for anti-aging products and surgeries and procedures and services all over our country and all over the world, really. People, as they get older, try to fight it. They don't want to look older, right? They dye the gray out of their hair. They put as much anti-wrinkle cream as they can buy on their face. So these kind of signs of natural aging in our society are oftentimes, a cause for embarrassment or shame or like evidence that, we've lost something. We've lost our youth. And if our society values youth so greatly, well, that's not really something that, we're socialized to really look forward to. So the elderly can be, kind of relegated to feeling like an outsider of our society, as feeling invisible or pushed aside, or devalued. So two little terms to get us started here. So we've got gerontology and social gerontology. Gerontology is just a broader field of science that kind of just studies aging, the process of aging, all the different challenges that our elderly members of society confront as they get older. Social gerontology is kind of the sociological aspect to this field of science. So we're going to be studying, the social and sociological aspects of this aging process. So we'll look at later on today, things like grief and the process of dying, our mental and physical well-being, and also reflect on, some of these cultural attitudes that we have about the elderly and how that affects, how certain historical trends that we've talked about earlier in the class maybe affect how we interpret the elderly in our society. So what does it mean to be, elderly or old, right? When does our youth end? When are we at our prime of life? And when are we old? If I asked everyone listening, this separately, we might all come up with different answers, which kind of shows that, how we think about what's young, what's old, what's middle age is all kind of a social construction, and it changes with time too. So, we kind of create this concept of being old or elderly through our interactions with other people. And our answers to this might change over time. Like if you're 18 years old right now, and I just asked you these questions, you might be thinking, oh, 30 years old is middle age and 45 is old. However, once you turn 30, you might think, 50 is middle age and 75 is old. So, where we are in our own timeline and our own age also affects how we think about, the aging of, like age in general, like when are we old or elderly? We keep pushing it off to the future, right? We never want to be actually in that definition of old. Now, according to our institutions, our U.S. government has kind of traditionally defined old age as being 65 years old or older. And that's usually, for a very long time, that was the point when you would become eligible for Medicare, our kind of universal healthcare system for older Americans, and for Social Security. Now that's changed, the age has changed for Social Security, but we'll get to that a little later. But 65 traditionally has become, kind of like the go-to retirement age, this definition of this is when we hit old age. Another institution, the AARP, the American Association for Retired Persons, they require members to be 50 to join. So they kind of define maybe kind of this definition of elderly or old, a little bit younger. Now our U.S. Census has been tracking age since 1790 in our country. And in the U.S. right now, our median age is about 38 years old. However, when we look at this in some historical context, it'll be clear that our country is getting older. So the median age back in 1950, the median age was 30 years old. So now it's 38. So we're kind of steadily increasing our median age over time. And if you look over here at this little graph I got for you, you can kind of see this, this intersection right here where, by 2035, the projection is that elderly adults 65 and older are going to make up just under 24% of our population, about 1/4, whereas children who typically, in our history have made up a larger proportion of the population, by 2035 are going to be only about 20% of the overall population. So there's going to be fewer children and a larger chunk of older adults coming up in our very, very near future here. Now, so our population, obviously from the last slide, we're getting older. There are going to be more elderly people in our population as a share of the total whole in the coming decades. So some more context for you here. In 1900, there were about 3 million people in the US over age 65. That was only 4% of the total population. By 1994, about 33 million people over age 65 in the US, about 12% of the total population. And today, there's over 54 million people over age 65 in our country, and that is about 16% of that total population. So that percentage of the elderly of the total population just also continues to climb as well. And why is that? Oftentimes this kind of aging of America is also referred to as the graying of America. So one reason why this is happening is improvements in healthcare and sanitation and vaccinations and our life expectancy. People are living longer than they used to. Back in 1900, life expectancy was 47 years old. So dang, in 1900, if you made it to like 45, you were an old person. So see how, this definition of old is very much socially constructed according to where you are in location and where you are in time. By 1970, life expectancy was 70 years old. Today, it's 77. So our life expectancy has kind of been climbing over time, especially since 1900. Now, keep in mind, as usual, our term of intersectionality, kind of, how our life expectancies also intersect with our race and our sex as well. So if we break down life expectancy by race, looking back in time at 1900, the average white American was living to about 47, but the average Black American was living to 33 in 1900, which means, well, dang, I'd be past my expiration date right now. Today, there are still kind of these inequities when it comes to life expectancy and race. The average white American today lives to about 77. The average Black American lives to about 72, so 5 fewer years. And the average Hispanic American lives actually a longer life at 79 years. Then when we take in sex into account, that affects things too. You may have heard before that women live longer than men. So back in 1900, that was true as well. Females tended to live until about 48 years old, while males were living until 46. Today, that age gap, age, sex, gender gap still exists. The average female lives until about 80 years today. The average male until age 75. So a 5-year gap. Now, another big reason beyond life expectancy for why the graying of America is happening are our boomers, our baby boomer generation. So anyone who was born kind of between 1946 and 1964, we can refer to as a boomer or a baby boomer. And of course, this was coming out of World War II. All the soldiers came home and reunited with their loved ones, and They made babies, and there was a baby boom. So the baby boomers, by now, they're kind of reaching their 60s and their 70s. Um, and there are a very large population of babies that were born. So it's a large influx of people who are kind of reaching this quote unquote elderly stage, right? Now, baby boomers in general, think back to the 60s and 70s, kind of this generation has redefined a lot of what it means to be alive and be an American and be free, right? The whole hippie generation. So they've kind of been redefining what it means to be young, what it means to be middle-aged, and now, what it means to be old. They don't want to grow up like they saw their parents or their grandparents, doing. They want to stay active and, um, in control, right, and vital. So kind of all this like anti-aging industry is really geared at our baby boomer population. A whole bunch of products to kind of guard against, signs of aging. They don't want to be old. They want to live forever, as we all do. So baby boomers, they don't want to end their active lives just because they hit 65. They want to stay active. They want to go skydiving and have fun, stay, involved in community and in their families, and maybe even their work life. So healthcare, if you are, majoring in healthcare, listen to these next few slides here. If you want some really good job security in the future. So healthcare is going to be a really, really, really critical area affecting, our baby boomers in the next 10, 20, 30 years, 5 years today. So healthcare spending is projected to increase by 5.4% every year from now to 2028. And government spending on Medicare has been increasing steadily, just as steadily as our elderly population has been increasing. So in 2009, Medicare spending was about 3% of our GDP, our gross domestic product in the US. By 2030, it's projected to be 8% of our GDP. And by 2080, it's projected to be 15% of our GDP. So we're spending a lot more money on kind of this Medicare program, which provides much needed health care to our 65 and older population. Now, the American Geriatric Society has noted that from 2013 to 2025, there's going to be a 45% increase in demand for physicians who specialize in treating the elderly. And this demand is only going to grow into the future. So if you are in healthcare, consider going into specializing in treating the elderly. It's going to be a very, very high demand job, and only more so over the course of our lives. So to meet this demand, the U.S. is going to require over 33,000 specialists in geriatric treatment in the very near future. Just for some perspective here, in 2020, there were only 6,230 such specialists in our country, and we need 33,000. So, that's a pretty big gap right there. We're going to have a 65 plus population of 54.1 million. That leaves one geriatric specialist for every 8,683 older Americans. Now think about if you are studying medicine, have you taken any classes that have like really focused on geriatrics or, treatment of the elderly? Or, have you been encouraged to go into maybe specializing in this field? A survey of medical schools in the US revealed that less than half, about 41%, have a structured geriatrics curriculum, and less than a quarter, 23%, require a geriatric clerkship. A lot of undergraduate nursing programs don't really require any gerontological coursework, and even though every nursing and medicine program requires some sort of pediatrics rotation, it's not the same. That's not true for geriatrics. And like we saw several slides back, our geriatric population is going to be in much higher demand than our pediatric one will be by 2035. Moreover, our pharmacists aren't really studying geriatrics as much as they maybe should be either. So older patients are the largest consumer group of prescription and over-the-counter medications. 26% of older adults use 5 or more prescriptions at a time. Y'all should see my dad is 72. And I get overwhelmed looking at his little medicine box. He has definitely more than 5 that he takes a day. And a lot of elderly people do. However, less than 1% of pharmacists have geriatric certification, and only half of pharmacy programs offer an elective course in geriatric care. But when you're older and you're taking 5 or more prescription drugs, drugs can have like synergistic effects on each other. They can help each other work better, or they can have antagonistic effects, where maybe one drug cancels out the other one. And so it's important, right, for pharmacists to kind of be aware of all of these different, drugs that especially elderly people are being prescribed, and understanding the way that those drugs and prescriptions can interact and maybe have a better or a worse effect on the patient. Now, the economic impact of our aging boomers is of concern. Now, we talked earlier in this semester about, our rising standards of living in the U.S. over the course of the 20th century. And the baby boomer generation was definitely, a beneficiary of that. Coming out of World War II, growing up, standards of living were rising pretty steadily over the 50s and 60s and 70s, and slowed down in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but still generally pretty high standards. However, a lot of baby boomers also, have spent their money kind of lavishly. They haven't really saved or planned for retirement. And many of them didn't plan to be living as long as they are living, and as long as our life expectancy is allowing us to today. So today, 8,000 to 10,000 boomers turn 65 every single day, and 2/3 of them have not adequately saved for retirement in which they can maintain their lifestyle. So the median savings in a 401k plan for people between 55 and 64 is currently $15,000, which may sound like a lot to some of you. It sounds like a lot to me. But if you consider, you have 15,000 to help you live another 15 years, maybe, 1,000 a year basically is not too much, right? In the grand scheme of things. A lot of older Americans have also kind of counted on Social Security payments to help them get by through the years, through their retirement. However, Social Security doesn't completely replace your paycheck, right? It only actually replaces about 40% of the average worker's income when they retire. So if you were making, let's say $1,000 a week, you can only, you should only really count on getting about $400 a week through Social Security. So as a result, of having not enough savings, a lot of older Americans are continuing to work past age 65. Back in the year 2000, only 3% of our elderly population, 65 plus, was continued to be in the workforce. Today, almost 12.5% of our population over 65 is continuing to work. Now, speaking of Social Security, if you pay attention to politics, this becomes a little hot button issue every few years. But Social Security is also considered, at risk alongside Medicare. Remember, Medicare is projected to be 15% of our GDP by 2080. But Social Security is also kind of viewed as, maybe quote unquote going broke as well. So a lot of economists are warning, if we don't really change something substantial about Social Security, it might collapse by the year 2037, mostly because of kind of the worker beneficiary ratio, because fewer workers are going to be paying in to the system and more retirees are going to be taking money out. So if you look at this little graphic over here, you'll see back in 1950, there were about 16 active workers between, ages 18 and 64, and they were paying their, every time they got a paycheck, they paid into Social Security. So there were 16 active workers for every one beneficiary, one retired person collecting their Social Security. By 2013, it was about three workers for every one beneficiary, for every one retiree. And the projection is by early 2030, it's going to be 2 workers for every one retiree. So this population paying in is shrinking with respect to, the number of retirees. So some people are suggesting, we should change the retirement age. Maybe a lot of us listening right now, we might have to wait till we reach 70 years old to collect our Social Security. Now, little caveat, they have already changed the age. It's not 65 anymore. If you were born after 1960, then we, myself included, we're going to have to wait at this point until we reach age 67 to get our Social Security payments. But who knows, by the time we get there, they might have to raise that age again in order to keep, the system functioning. And then, some more perspective here. Back in 1950, the government paid $781 million to Social Security. Today, those payments are 870 times higher than that. And about 30% of all of our tax dollars are spent either on Social Security or Medicare. So, this is not just happening in the US, this is happening all over the world. Back in 2019, the world had 703 million people age 65 and over. By 2050, that number is expected to double to 1.5 billion people over 65. And by that point, 1 out of every 6 people across the globe is expected to be 65 years old or over. Similar to like the Social Security kind of formula there, this is going to have a really big impact more generally on something we call the dependency ratio. Basically, like this picture over here, there are people who are quote unquote dependents in our lives, right? Like children and the elderly. And it's expected that, the the middle-aged people between ages 18 and 64, right, are going to be, providing for the dependents, holding them up, helping them to have a place to live and food on the table and care. But obviously, with such a growing elderly population, where 1 out of 6 people globally is going to be 65 and over, that's going to have a really big effect on our dependency ratio. Now, China is facing a pretty serious aging crisis. They have about 178 million citizens today that are over 60 years old, and that's currently about 13% of their population. However, by 2050, it's expected that 1 out of every 3 Chinese citizens will be 60 years old or over. That's 33%, 33.3% of the population. And that has a lot to do with, that one-child policy that China had for a long time. So obviously the effect of that is, by 2050, there aren't going to be as many, working, able-bodied adults to take care of the older, dependent, elderly population in China. And countries all over the world are facing kind of similar issues as we are, and will be over the next several decades of, how to provide kind of some sort of guaranteed income for elderly people, how to provide health care, how to train our healthcare professionals in specializing in, geriatric care as well. Now, in Asian societies, they tend to think a little bit differently about, how they think about the elderly. In a lot of countries like, China or Korea or Japan. So that's because, going back to old Confucian values that go back thousands of years, there's this very strong, almost religious belief in what's called filial piety. Basically, like respect for your family. And in particular, kind of a deference to your parents, your ancestors, and your elders. And it's very much, this is something that's written into a lot of Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Chinese religious texts. It's considered, vital for society. If you want to have a healthy society, a functioning society, then you will maintain this virtue of reverence and respect for, the elderly and for those who came before you. In the U.S., though, some of us might have kind of that reverence and taught to us. We also tend to view most people, and also older people, as kind of, independent, responsible for taking care of themselves. And often, our decisions to care for an elderly relative are not so much based on like a religious belief of filial piety, but, more on like, what have they done for me lately kind of a thing. The promise of future returns, maybe, oh, will I get an inheritance? Do I have one coming? Or, what did they do for me when I was growing up? Were they good, a good mother or father or aunt or uncle, grandmother, grandfather? And do they deserve me to now, sacrifice myself to them? So a lot of, particularly white Americans, tend to place a lot of elderly relatives into out-of-home assisted care. And this is not as common among Asian, Black, or Hispanic Americans yet. Now, on the topic of aging around the world, back in 2002, more than 20 years ago, there was an international conference put on by the United Nations called the Madrid Plan, or the Assembly on Aging, and they published something called the Madrid Plan that came out of this. They met in Madrid, Spain, so that's why it's called that. But it was kind of an international meeting to really talk about a lot of these subjects that I've just gone over, because they saw this coming. They were like, our elderly population over the next century is going to completely explode, and we need to be prepared as countries globally. So they got together to kind of come up with some sort of comprehensive social policies to start implementing to get ready for this aging population. So they wanted to raise consciousness about things like the vulnerability of the elderly, social exclusion, poverty, prejudice, discrimination, social and legal protections. And they also, because it's the UN, they linked these issues with kind of larger issues of the human rights of the elderly and empowerment. Now, since that plan came out in 2002, the UN Madrid Plan of Action comes together about every 5 years to kind of do like a little update on the Madrid Plan to see like, okay, what were our goals in 2002? Where are we in trying to achieve those? What's our status report, basically? So about every 5 years they get together and talk about these goals and the progress toward them. So the most recent one was in July of 2020, and they did a 20-year follow-up to the World Assembly of Aging. Got a link there if you want to look at it. But I put some of like the key highlights on the next few slides here. So two excerpts that came out of it. Got current underlying societal and policy structures that support long-standing assumptions of a life in 3 stages of full-time education, then continuous work, followed by complete retirement, are not aligned with the realities of the population aging and extended longevity. Policies can and should play an important role in shaping the future of work with a life course approach. So they're saying here, the way that we've commonly thought of our life course as like, we're children, then we become adults and we're full, and we, go to college and then we graduate and we go to work full time for 40 years or whatever, and then we retire at 65. They're basically saying like that's outdated. People are living longer. They don't want to retire when they're 65. We're also living till we're like 80. So, maybe being retired for like 15 years is a little bit extreme. So they're, kind of just pointing out maybe we have to start rethinking kind of how we think of like our life course. Second excerpt here, countries will need to review the concept of population aging and what old age looks like, shifting from a depiction of older persons as a homogeneous group, like they're all the same, and population aging as a burden on societies, to a forward-thinking view that recognizes the social and economic contributions of older persons and that embraces the potential of an aging population as a basis for future development. Well, yeah, if 1 in 6 people around the globe pretty soon are going to be 65 and older, I definitely would say, I would agree with them. We need a more forward-thinking view to encompass, the strengths of and contributions that older people can offer to our societies and our economies. Then they go on to kind of list 8 different proposals of where they think we should be kind of going with this Madrid plan into the future. So we've got number 1, ensure that social protection systems, including access to long-term protection and equitable and universal health care, are adequate and follow a life course approach. Number 2, achieve economic security in old age and address the adverse impact of discrimination and inequalities experienced during the life course by older persons, in particular women. Number 3, enable persons to reach old age in better economic conditions by supporting the transition from informal to formal work and adequately valuing the economic contribution of unpaid care work, which we talked about in chapter 12. Number 4, adopt measures that combat age-based discrimination and correct damaging stereotypes in employment, among employers, and in society at large, such as legislation and public awareness campaigns. 5, establish and promote an effective lifelong learning system that enables people to acquire skills, upskill, and reskill throughout their life course. 6, provide incentives encouraging employers to retain and hire older workers and promote good practices in managing and harnessing an age-diverse workforce. Number 7, 2 more, encourage longer and more satisfying careers, including by offering flexible and part-time work arrangements, exploiting the potential of new technologies, adapting jobs and workplaces to facilitate the retention and employment of older workers with disabilities. And lastly, promote self-employment among older persons and support older entrepreneurs. So that's our little update to the Madrid plan coming out of their 2020 meeting. All right, now we're going to turn to kind of a new little topic here, kind of the process of aging and this kind of idea of the life course, which for a long time has kind of, referred to this picture. We're born infants, we grow into children, preteens, teenagers, young adults, then middle and old age. And there's kind of like a trajectory of dependence to independence, back to dependence here, right? When you're an infant, you're pretty dependent on the people around you to care for you. Then the idea is that when we are, middle age, right, we're fairly independent people, and then we grow back to dependence in our older age. Now, age, like a lot of things we talk about in this class, like our race, like our gender, can oftentimes become kind of a master status for us. Meaning, it's like the first thing that we think about ourselves when we're asked, who we are, what our identity is. But also, it's one of the first things that when people meet us or perceive us, it's one of the first things that maybe come to their mind. How old we are. So a few different changes that happen as we get older. Probably the most obvious would be our biological changes. You got, your primary aging, things that you can't really control, molecular and cellular changes, the wrinkling of skin, your hair going gray. But also things like secondary aging, things that maybe we can control, like, high blood pressure. We can control that maybe if we eat better, right? Or gaining weight and losing muscle. Maybe we can control that to an extent by our physical exercise. Now, most of us are going to see these signs of aging by age 50. Beginning to lose our hair, or gray hair, or wrinkling skin, declining energy, new food sensitivities, loss of hearing, vision, memory. But the most frequently reported health issues for people over 65 are arthritis, hypertension, heart disease, and cancer. Now, there's been a kind of a steady improvement in a lot of these kind of disability measures for elderly Americans. However, at the same time, there's been kind of an increase in other impairments and diseases. Now, social and psychological changes are also affecting us as we get older, beyond just the biological. Even, something like this idea of retirement, right, is pretty new. In 1900, we weren't really growing much older than like 45, 47. So retirement, no, who's going to retire when you're only, that old? But so this idea of like withdrawing from our work at a certain age is a pretty recent idea. Up until, the late 20th century, people were working, pretty long hours. It should be 19th century. They're working 60 hours a week pretty much until they couldn't work anymore. In the 21st century, most people hope that we're going to be able to retire at some point one day. We'll work hard for 40, 50 years, and then one day we can put our feet up and enjoy the fruits of our labor. Now, in retirement, and we'll get back to this toward the end here, but a lot of people, enjoy retirement. They join churches or religious activities. They find new groups. They, start new hobbies or activities or join new clubs. But others, kind of find it to be a time period of like uncertainty. Because what's one of the first things that you say to someone you meet? What's your name? What do you do, right? What we do, where we work is such a huge part of our identity. And so a lot of elderly people, when they come to retirement, it's like that role, that social role that we've held for decades, that part of our identity that's become so inherent to who we are, all of a sudden is gone. So what happens to your self-worth when that, aspect of yourself is gone? So one sociologist named Erik Erikson, he claimed that the life course was divided into 8 different stages, which you can see on this picture here. We're only going to focus on the last stage, though, of old age. But he said in each stage of our life, there's kind of like this choice between 2 different things. For infants, trust versus mistrust. For toddlers, autonomy versus shame and doubt. For preschoolers, initiative versus guilt. For grade schoolers, industry versus inferiority. And so on, until we get to old age, when the main challenge that we face is, are we going to embrace integrity or despair? So Erik Erikson, claimed that older people, no matter who you are, you're going to have regrets. We all have regrets, right? And the challenge is to kind of like confront these regrets, the things that we couldn't do, the goals we never reached, the things that we wanted to do but we never could, and to start to face those with, what he called integrity, with kind of an honest like hope and gratitude for the things that we did do, rather than despairing over, and lingering in despair over all the things that we couldn't do. So he said, if we choose integrity, we'll choose to live creatively, to learn new skills, to practice new things. But if we choose despair, well, we might end up being that grumpy old grandpa that, our media likes to portray all elderly as. All right. Here's the fun part, aging and sexuality. So just because we get old doesn't mean we don't stop getting it on. So when we reach old age, the fear of unwanted pregnancy is gone. Women have gone through menopause, children are grown and out of the house, they take care of themselves, so we have some privacy. And a lot of medical research has gone into elderly sexuality and, things like male and female sexual dysfunction can be treated, with a pill. And so older people still have sex, y'all. So our sexual selves don't just disappear after we're 65. It's not like, oh, we retired and now we're, never going to be naked or have sex again or, have any romantic feeling. And a lot of people continue to enjoy sex, often unprotected sex, well into their later years. 40% of adults between 65 and 80 in the US report having an active sex life. 50% of men between 65 and 80 reported being extremely or very interested in sex, while that was only true for 12% of older women. But still. Now, unfortunately, as I've said on the last slide, oftentimes the sex that the elderly are having is unprotected. And, in their way of thinking, they're probably like, oh, well, we're not going to get pregnant, so what's the use? Why bother, right? However, as many of us know, you don't just wear a condom or protect yourself because of pregnancy, maybe that's one part, but also to protect yourself from, sexually transmitted infections and other diseases. So patients over 60 account for the biggest increase of in-office treatments for sexually transmitted infections. In adults over age 80, diagnosis rates for herpes simplex, gonorrhea, syphilis, hepatitis B, and chlamydia rose 23% between 2014 and 2017. And sadly, 1 out of every 5 new cases of AIDS occurs in adults over 65 years old. So this is another, issue with kind of how we stereotype older people, right? We don't think of them as sexual, and yet they are, and they are having sex, and this is the result. And doctors don't even really talk to a lot of their older patients about, their sexual activities and their health and protection. And only about 17% of older adults report consulting with their doctors about any of this. Of course, our aging LGBTQ plus population is also, faces some different challenges as they get older. And for a lot of the elderly in this population, most of their lives, they've been very stigmatized in our society. It's only very recently that gay marriage was federally decided to be, legal across the country. And for many, many years of their lives, there were probably laws in their cities and states, against their identities. So this is another thing, in the years to come, the number of LGBTQ plus elders is expected to double by 2030. They tend to have higher rates of disability and depression. And that's because, for such a long time, they were not allowed to get married or have children or raise a family. And so LGBTQ plus elders are a lot less likely to have a support system like a spouse or a partner or children or grandchildren to help them, to care for them. They also face, if they are put into an assisted living home, there's all these issues of disclosure management, like who do you want to tell? Who do you want? There's still these issues of, can I come out of the closet? Only 22% of LGBTQ elders report they are comfortable disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity to their long-term care facility because they fear being discriminated against. And only 16% of non-LGBTQ older adults expected that LGBTQ people could be open with facility staff. All right, now turning away from gender identity, sexuality, to a little bit of a darker topic, death and dying, at least darker for us in our society. So for many of us, the first time we experienced grief or loss or death was probably from losing a grandparent or an older relative, or maybe a family pet. But grief refers to a psychological, emotional, and social response to the feeling of loss that accompanies death or a similar event. Now, again, kind of how we think about death is very socially constructed. It results from the values of our culture, of our religious beliefs, uh, and the values of our society. So a lot of cultures around the world, interpret death as something that's inevitable, the circle of life, the natural part of life. And for some cultures, maybe death is more of like a celebration that a soul has moved on in its spiritual journey. Um, and many religions, believe in rebirth and reincarnation. So, if one body dies, then the soul moves on to the next body and moves on in its cycle of, reincarnation. In our society, we don't tend to, kind of think this way about death. We view it more as like an irretrievable loss, something to be scared of, something to ignore, to not talk about um, until it's too late. And evidence of this is shown in a lot of the euphemisms we use instead of talking about death. We talk about, oh, they've gone to heaven, they've kicked the bucket, they've passed away, they're pushing up the daisies, they've breathed their last breath, they cashed in their chips, they're going to meet their maker, they've expired, right? Anything we can say other than addressing death face on. And even funerals in our country, tend to be pretty restrained events, very quiet, dignified, organized. They're held at, institutions like funeral parlors. They, take place within a certain time span, and it's like, okay, your grieving process is going to take place from 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. on this date. And, then we will bury the body of your loved one, and then, you will move on. And it's very, very much a time and an event where, the grieving of the mourners, right, is meant to be very controlled. Public wailing and excessive tears and yelling or screaming are not really viewed as like something that's very acceptable. It makes other people uncomfortable. However, not all societies, confront death and grieving in this way. For instance, one example would be in Judaism. There's a practice of sitting Shiva when a loved one dies in, the Jewish family or Jewish faith. And this is a very long grieving process. It usually lasts 7 days. And it doesn't take place in a funeral parlor. It takes place in the home of the closest relatives. And there's all sorts of rituals and rules. Like, it lasts 7 days. They they light a Shiva candle that they never blow out for all 7 days. The wax will last. They're made to. The mourners are meant to sit very low to the ground because they are, meant to be kind of, grounding into their grief. They're supposed to like cover up any reflective surface like a TV or a cell phone or a mirror, because you're supposed to be, reflecting on the inner self and like your stillness of your soul. And they recite a Jewish funeral prayer called the Kaddish. They can do that up to 3 times a day for 7 days. In this picture they are, but they're not really supposed to wear socks or shoes because you're supposed to kind of signify this humility. You're not supposed to shave or really wear makeup or do any kind of like your daily grooming rituals. Some of the closest family members might wear clothing that's like torn at the heart to, show and signify this loss that they're mourning. And then they serve foods like bagels and donuts, like round foods that signify the circle of life. And the close family is not supposed to do any work or engage in any entertainment during Shiva. Their mourners' worlds are supposed to have stopped. They're supposed to stop and reflect for 7 days to mindfully grieve the loss of their loved one. So, it's a little bit of a contrast to kind of your average, right, American funeral, which takes place, again, kind of in a very highly organized way, in a very set time period, usually somewhere away from home. So the way that, we confront death and dying and grieve also is very, relevant to the society, the religious values that we hold as well. Now, back in the 60s, there's a sociologist named Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and she wrote a very famous book called On Death and Dying. And she was studying and interviewing people who were terminally ill, and they were, facing their deaths. And she started to witness kind of their transition toward accepting dying, and that they would, very soon be facing the end of their lives. And she started to recognize kind of these common threads in their experiences, what they were going through, how they were thinking about it. And so she said, well, when people are coming to terms with their own death, elder adults or people with terminally ill, people who are terminally ill, go through 5 stages. And she labeled these the 5 stages of grief. So stage 1 is denial. This is not happening to me. The doctor must have my diagnosis wrong. What medical school did they go to? They're wrong. I need more tests. There must be some treatment my doctor doesn't know about out there that can save me. I feel fine. This isn't happening. Stage 2, anger. So we move past denial and we get angry. Life is unfair. Why is this happening to me? This is unjust. The patient might begin to lash out and be mean and yell at medical professionals or their loved ones. And moving past that stage, get to stage 3 of bargaining, going to God. Oh God, if I only do this, can I please live another 5 years or 10 years? Kind of this negotiation with any higher power to postpone kind of what seems to be inevitable. If I just reform my ways, change the way that I live, can I have another year or 2? Stage 4 is depression, kind of getting toward the end here. The individual starts to resign from their life, cries, wallows in fears and anxieties and despair and hopelessness. And hopefully, the grieving person gets through all 4 of those stages to stage 5, where they become more accepting of, the situation. Past the depression, they start to accept, this is my fate, and try to face that final stage in Erickson's terms, with integrity. Start to adjust to the idea that their life is coming to a close, and what do I want to do before this happens? Let's start to face death honestly and, make the most of our time with people while we have it. So that's Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And kind of inspired by Kubler-Ross's work, very soon after the publication of her book, hospices started to sprout up across the United States. There was kind of a changing perspective of death and dying in our country. So hospice care is kind of an indicator of a changing view of death in our society. It's a type of healthcare that treats terminally ill people when, cures or treatments are no longer really a viable option. When doctors have already done everything they can for this patient and it just nothing seems to be taking or working or making the person better, then they might choose to go into hospice care, where at least, there will be doctors, nurses, and therapists who have special training in the care of the dying. The focus here is not to find a cure or to fix you or to get you better, but on kind of accepting, like, this is the end. Let's figure out how to do this with you as peacefully as possible, to make you as happy and comfortable and fulfilled as possible as we work through this stage of the end of your life. So hospice services, oftentimes they can be at home, or they can be like in a building, in a standalone institution. But the positive is, you're not in this like stressful hospital environment where they're like constantly doing tests on you and giving you new drugs and this, that, and the other. You're kind of monitored by responsible health professionals, but you can also be surrounded by your family and your pets and your loved ones and, be pretty fulfilled in your final, weeks or months. So hospice care, like I said, can be in the home, could be in a hospital or a nursing home, or there's also, some standalone hospice, buildings, institutions. There's interdisciplinary teams of caregivers here, doctors, nurses, social workers, clergy, therapists, and volunteers who all work together to make hospice happen. Following Kubler-Ross's book, the first hospice was opened in the U.S. in Connecticut in 1974. Today, there's over 5,000 hospice agencies across our country, and about 65% of terminally ill Americans are spending their final, days, weeks in the comfort of hospice care. Now, the term thanatology refers to a systematic study of death and dying. And something that's really interesting to a lot of thanatologists is the concept of dying with dignity. So we're going to turn to another guy here named Jack Kevorkian. And he was really big in the 90s, a very controversial subject indeed. But he was a very passionate advocate for physician-assisted suicide, sometimes called PAS. And that refers to the voluntary or physician-assisted use of lethal medication provided by a medical doctor to end somebody's life. Obviously, I said this was controversial. Dr. Kevorkian, who was nicknamed Dr. Death, helped over 130 terminally ill people to end their own lives over the course of his career. He developed 2 different machines, he called them the Thanatrons, I believe, to assist in a patient's suicide. One would administer a lethal injection, the other one released carbon monoxide through a breathing mask. Notably, he would supply the machines and the drugs or the carbon monoxide, but he designed the machines in such a way that the patient themselves would have to flick a switch or pull a little rope so that they were the one kind of administering this fatal dose to themselves, even though Kevorkian was the one who supplied all of the machine to them. And he was usually around in the room or in the next room to make sure everything went according to plan. But he believed physician-assisted suicide should be legal. And he actually spent 8 years in prison for his work in physician-assisted suicide. He was convicted of second-degree murder in 1999 in Michigan. But he believed that it was an important thing to fight for and be passionate about. I believe he watched his own mom. She had a terminal illness, and when the doctors in the hospital, back when she was passing away, when they decided there's nothing else we can do, they essentially just cut off her food and water and just let her kind of essentially be starved to death over the course of several days. And so that really affected Kevorkian, and his perspective on how we treat terminally ill people. And he felt, that kind of practice, this kind of passive, suicide, let's call it, passive way of letting someone go, of cutting off their food and their water, he felt that that was a pretty cruel way to treat someone. And so he viewed kind of this practice of physician-assisted suicide as something, relatively more humane. Now, obviously, this issue of dying with dignity and physician-assisted suicide carries a lot of controversial weight to it, especially if you're a religious person, right? Then there's an aspect of, are doctors playing God here, right? Or what if a doctor, what if something like this was to become legal? Where would we draw the line? At what point, would a doctor be able to decide that someone should die or not? So it's still pretty controversial, but there are several states that have legalized it over time. In the U.S., Oregon was the first state to pass a law allowing physician-assisted suicide in 1997, and they required 2 physicians to be present for a legal assisted suicide. Today, it's legal in Washington, D.C., California, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, Montana, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. But certainly not a majority of states, and it's not legal in more states than it is legal in. All right, almost getting there, y'all. So last thing here, before we get to theories, are challenges facing the elderly. So aging, as we've already kind of touched on, comes with a lot of challenges and changes. We are kind of, as we get older, we lose our independence more and more. We lose our physical abilities, our biological changes, right? We also might face age discrimination or financial insecurities. So not too long ago, growing older in the U.S. meant living with less income. In 1960, about 35% of the elderly lived on poverty-level incomes. 2008, that number was 9.7, so much better. That probably has a lot to do with the passage of Medicare, which happened in 65. Of course, following the 2008 recession, a lot of retirement accounts got really hit, lost 18% of their value, and the poverty rate for the elderly rose to 14% following that. Today, though, the elderly poverty rate has gone back down to about 9%, and about 23% of our sheltered homeless population is made up of elderly Americans, however. But poverty levels are better than definitely that 35% rate of 1960. So why is that? Number one, women joined the workforce during this time period from 1960 to 1970s, 80s, and 90s. That meant that couples who are getting to be elderly today have been bringing in two incomes for a family throughout their married lives. So they probably have more savings, um, maybe two retirement plans. Then also during this time period, private employers and governments started to offer better retirement programs. And like I said, Medicare was created in 1965. Another issue elderly people might face is ageism, which refers to discrimination based on age. And it exists in all cultures, though, to different degrees. And ageist attitudes and biases based on stereotypes reduce elderly people to kind of these inferior or limited positions. They can be kind of pushed out of their jobs, or they may not be hired for a job that they apply for. They might feel dismissed by a doctor or feel like they don't have as much power or control over the decisions of their daily life. Now, a lot of pre-industrial societies practice what we call gerontocracy, a type of society where the power is held by the oldest members of society. The elderly are respected, they're revered, they're cared for by everyone. Kind of that concept of filial piety could fall into this gerontocratic society. Now, reverence for the elderly, it still exists in some cultures, but it has changed in a lot of places due to social or economic factors. For instance, our industrial revolution, right? Going back to that from the early chapters, our modern societies have changed a lot of things about how we view elderly people, and has kind of led to their diminished social standing. Today when we think of, the wealthy, the powerful, the prestigious, we associate it with younger age brackets, younger people, people who are, invested in tech and media, and we have this huge emphasis in our society on like constantly evolving and updating and new skills and new technologies. And that in many ways, if there's no retraining, can disadvantage elderly people who didn't grow up in that certain skill set. And a lot of their experience is not maybe in, kind of the technology that we have today. And also another factor to this is, kind of this transition from agrarian to industrial societies that happened in the late 1800s. When we had agrarian societies, people worked at home. They worked on the farm. They did things inside the house. They made clothes and sewed this and that and the other. And so elderly people still retained like a very integral role in the society, in agrarian societies. But with industrialism, all of a sudden, right, people are leaving the home, they go to work, and they come home at the end of the day. And that makes it, a little bit harder on the elderly to stay as involved in economic decisions and participation. They might not have the strength or the stamina to continue working outside the home. And thus, we have this kind of new way of viewing the elderly as like a burden, because they're not able to like keep up with, our post-industrial, industrial, ways of life. Another issue that might face the elderly comes with, this issue of dependency, right? When we get older, we might become more dependent on people for our care. And so elder abuse happens, unfortunately. And this occurs when a caretaker intentionally deprives an older person of care or harms the person in his or her charge. Caregivers might be family members. It could be a friend or a health professional or an employee of a housing or nursing care facility. So we have 5 major categories of elder abuse here. Number 1 is financial exploitation. So if the caregiver, makes a change to somebody's will, or adds additional names to their bank cards, or commits identity fraud. Number 2, neglect or failure to provide adequate care. So failing to bathe, the person, or give them water, or treat their bed sores, or make sure they're moving. Or not changing their bedding if they've, messed the bed. Psychological or emotional abuse, like verbal harassment or humiliation. Physical abuse, like hitting, shaking, intentionally giving an overdose of medication, not treating wounds. And then lastly, sexual abuse, things like, coerced nudity, or even rape. So recent studies have found that about 10% of elderly Americans have suffered at least one form of elder abuse. However, like we've talked about with a lot of crime reporting, elder abuse specifically is very underreported. Especially if somebody has dementia or Alzheimer's, or is bedridden, it's going to be really hard for them to report the abuse that is happening to them. So the true rate of elder abuse is probably much higher than 10%. And recent kind of estimates have claimed that maybe about 1 out of every 23 cases of elder abuse is actually reported. Now, a lot of studies have focused on the caregivers, the people who perpetrate elder abuse, and why they might do that. So some of the factors that they've concluded, that increase the likelihood of perpetrating abuse against an elder. Change my color up. Number 1, inexperience, having other demands like another job, having children to take care of as well. Living full-time with a dependent elder can cause, high stress, isolation, and possibly, a feeling of lack of support. A history of depression in a caregiver also increases the likelihood of elder abuse. A lot of caregivers who were abused themselves as children will abuse elders. And they found that neglect is more likely when care is provided by paid caregivers. And that generally, maybe in a nursing home or assisted living facility, the caregivers might have, they might feel burnt out, too many hours, they feel underpaid, like there's too many patients, that's overwhelming, and have low job satisfaction. And they also tend to be more likely to treat the elderly like children. All right, last few slides here. We're going to wrap up looking at some different theoretical perspectives when it comes to aging. So a lot of theories in this chapter, I'm sorry. But we'll just do a little review of each of these here. So as you can see how I laid out on this slide, there's 3 kind of aging theories for each paradigm that we look at. So we're going to look at 3 theories from structural functionalist paradigm: disengagement, activity, and continuity. Then we'll look at 3 theories from the conflict paradigm: modernization, age stratification, and exchange theory. And then we'll close out with 3 theories from symbolic interactionism. We've got subculture of aging theory, selective optimization with compensation theory, or gerotranscendence theory? All right, so we got our first structural functionalist theory here, disengagement. So this theory suggests that withdrawing from society and social relationships is normal. It's something that is functional for society, that as you get old, we all expect to die one day. We all experience physical and mental decline as we get older, and it's just normal. It's natural to withdraw from people and society. However, this theory has been critiqued because not everyone wants to withdraw, and be alone and like, um, separate themselves from, the people that they love and have come to depend on. The second functionalist theory is activity theory. So this one is kind of the opposite. For this theory, activity levels and social involvement are the key to the process of aging and the key to happiness. So the more active and involved an elderly person is, the happier they're going to be. So that can be any kind of activity, going to church, going to the local library and volunteering, being part of a running group or an exercise club or like a bridge club or any kind of hobby that you do with other people can affect your life satisfaction in later life. Of course, critics of this theory say that not all elders have the same access to these opportunities, these kind of activities. They're not equally available to everyone. Like if you live in a big city in Atlanta or something, or New York, there's probably all sorts of different groups and activities and clubs and whatnot that elderly people can join. But if you live out in like the boondocks, out in a very rural area with not a big population, there might not be as many opportunities for an elderly person to stay active and involved. Third structural functionalist theory is continuity theory. So this one says that the elderly should attempt to maintain social equilibrium and stability by making future decisions on the basis of already developed social roles. So the elderly should their goal should be to maintain consistency. Be the same person you always have been. You don't have to withdraw. You don't have to completely change yourself and become a marathon runner overnight. Be the same person. Maintain consistency. And, excuse me, critics claim that this theory emphasizes normal aging and neglects to address people who maybe have dementia or Alzheimer's, right? Where they can't even remember what their, previous role was. All right, now we're moving on to our conflict perspectives of aging. First one here is modernization theory, which I already kind of touched base on several slides ago. But this one is going to say the primary cause of the elderly losing power is or are these forces of industrialization and modernization. So we devalue the elderly and they're increasingly kind of pushed to the outskirts of society. We no longer, back in the agrarian times, people lived more with their extended families. But now that we're an industrial and post-industrial society, we tend to live with our nuclear family, the small, just our kids, not all this extended family. And that's kind of degraded the role of our older family members. Societies, we've also become really individualistic. And so we kind of assume elderly are just like the rest of us. They're individuals, they can take care of themselves. And the elderly, unable to work outside the home, have less to offer economically. They become viewed as a burden. Second one in conflict perspective is exchange theory. So this one suggests that as we become more dependent as we age, we have to submit to the will of others because we have fewer ways of compelling them to submit to us. So we have less to exchange, and so we must kind of just bend to other people's will. So they would assume, relationships are based on a mutual exchange. As people age, they have less on hand to exchange because they're retired, and they're becoming more physically dependent, and so their social circles and influence will diminish. So in this kind of theory, the only way to avoid being discarded by society is to engage in exchange with others. For example, holding on to a big inheritance, helping your grown children with caring for your grandchildren, making yourself, quote unquote, useful. Critics suggest this theory obviously, emphasizes material exchange a little bit too much, maybe doesn't give as much value to things like, lifelong love, and investment, and friendship. Then our third conflict theory is age stratification theory, which says that members of society are stratified by age just like we are stratified by race, gender, and class. So age is just another way that society, pits us against each other with different groupings. So age is kind of a basis of social control, and different age groups have varying access to social resources, like political and economic power. All right, we're going to round this out here with our symbolic interactionism perspectives. First one here is the subculture of aging theory. So this one focuses on shared community created by the elderly when they are excluded due to age, voluntarily or non-voluntarily, from participation in other groups. So elders, as they're getting older and people tend to be pushing them aside and whatnot, they find new groups. They create new groups. Join a club, start a club. They develop new patterns of interaction and make new friends who now, reflect their new interests and backgrounds. So they might create and find a strong sense of community in the new groups that they form. Second one is selective optimization with compensation theory. So this one asserts that elderly must balance the losses associated with aging with the gains stemmed from aging. So, you might lose a little something, but, you can make up for it by offering something else. So aging is here viewed as like a process and not an outcome. And the goals for each of us are very specific when we get older. Our energy might diminish as we age, but then we can select new goals to reach that maybe don't take as much energy. We can come up with new activities. We can make up for, this loss of things that we might have been able to do by finding new hobbies, new things that we can do and succeed at. So increased dependence does not need to mean a diminished life. That elders become more selective and save their energy for activities. Just cross that out. Energy for activities that hold the most meaning to them. And last little theory here is, under symbolic interactionism, is gerotranscendence theory. So this theory proposes that as people age, they transcend the limited views of life that they held earlier on. So in the earlier ages of their lives, individuals struggle to overcome their own failings and turn them into strengths. Throughout our aging process, the elderly become less self-centered, feel more peaceful and connected to the natural world. And this is where, our age-old wisdom comes in. And We start to generate wisdom as we get elderly. We start to tolerate ambiguities, seeming contradictions. We let go of the small things, let go of conflict, and develop softer views of right and wrong. So that brings us to the end of our many theories on aging. I'll leave you with this quote from Albert Einstein, but hope you've gotten something out of this lecture here on Chapter 13, Aging and the Elderly. If anything, if you are in medicine or studying to be a nurse or a pharmacist, I definitely recommend going into taking some classes that will specialize in elderly care, because our elderly population is only going to grow and grow and grow over the decades to come. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful day or night, whatever time it is that you're watching this. And reach out to me if you have any questions at all. I'll be happy to go over anything else with you. All right. Thank y'all. Talk to you next time.